The first comment is that, of course, this is a report relating to the involvement of the United Kingdom in the Iraq operation in 2003, and very particularly it focuses on the exchanges between the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Tony Blair, and the then President of the United States, George Bush, and also on the internal workings and processes of the British government leading to the intervention in March of 2003, and therefore it is of no direct relevance to Australia as far as that is concerned, but of course it does touch upon issues relating to the political justification, strategic intelligence, and also, importantly, the legal basis of the intervention. I would say one of the most relevant things that has come out of the Chilcott Inquiry, and let me say this is based entirely on my as yet incomplete reading of a very large executive summary. I don't pretend to have read the entire report, and I doubt that anybody in this room or anybody perhaps listening has read the report in full either. But one of the important conclusions that comes out of this report, and this is directly relevant to the claim that has been constantly made that in some way the intelligence was doctored by the British government, the American government, or by the Australian government that I led at the time in 2003. One of the interesting conclusions of Chilcott in a report that is not reluctant to criticise the then British government, and particularly Tony Blair, was the following. The JIC, that is the Joint Intelligence Committee, which is the broad equivalent in the United Kingdom of the Office of National Assessments in Australia, accepted ownership of the dossier and agreed its content. There is no evidence that intelligence was improperly included in the dossier or that number 10 improperly influenced the text. And that goes very directly to the substance of that particular allegation. So, having said those introductory remarks, I'd be very happy to take any questions you want to ask me on this issue, entering the necessary caveat that I have not, and I don't pretend to have read in full what is a very large report.
Mr. Howard, is it time for Australia to have such an inquiry?
Well, we've had a number of inquiries already.
The report says that on March 15, 2003, you asked Tony Blair if the diplomatic process has been exhausted, and he said, "We've reached an impasse." Chilcott found that diplomatic options hadn't been fully explored and exhausted.
Yep.
Do you believe that Tony Blair was upfront in his dealings with you?
Well, Tony Blair reached a different conclusion, and so did I. You've got to remember that this particular conclusion of Chilcott is an expression of opinion based on his retrospective, subsequent rather, after the event judgment of events. I shared the view that Tony Blair expressed. Otherwise, my government may have taken a different approach. What Chilcott reminds us of is that, largely in response to the views strongly put to the Americans by the British, the Bush administration decided to pursue a further resolution, and ultimately it obtained a further resolution. And when it was obvious to many, including the Australian government, that no progress was being made in the full implementation of that further resolution, an attempt was then made to garner support within the Security Council for yet another resolution authorising the use of military force. And it was very apparent to me, it was very apparent to the National Security Committee of the Australian government, that the combined determination of the Russians and the French to frustrate that further resolution meant that the diplomatic road had come to an end, and therefore, although Chilcott forms a different view, and you've got to remember that when you're dealing with things like that, they are differences of judgment. And I respect his view, but I disagree with it. And of course his view, despite his denials to the contrary, his views are naturally informed by subsequent events. We are all informed by subsequent events, but as somebody who's been in a decision-making position in relation to these matters, I make the obvious point that you make judgments based on the information available at the time. Context is everything, as a wise man once said, and it's very important to keep that in mind.
Did Australia need more information than what it was provided by Defence and Foreign Affairs, perhaps some independent advice?
Well, I regard Defence and Foreign Affairs and the intelligence agencies as providing highly professional advice. And can I just remind you again that despite what subsequently emerged as a result of the pursuit of stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction, that it was the judgment not only of the Joint Intelligence Committee in the United Kingdom, and that was informed principally but not only by MI6, but also the National Intelligence Assessment of October or November of 2002 in the United States, which is a distillation of the views of all of the American intelligence agencies, including the CIA, was that Iraq did possess weapons of mass destruction. Now that has been subsequently found not to be the case, particularly in relation to stockpiles, although there's no doubt from the work of the Iraq Survey Group that Iraq had the capacity to reconstitute its programs. And as Tony Blair pointed out last night in his reply to the Chilcott report, one of the very significant things to bear in mind in relation to this is that it was discovered very much to have been the strategy of the Saddam Hussein regime. Once the threat of sanctions had disappeared, which was their long-term goal, well, it was to reconstitute their WMD program. So I just have to make the point that, yes, it was subsequently discovered there were no stockpiles, but with equal conviction it has to be remembered that the intelligence advice of both the United Kingdom and the United States, and of course that advice greatly informed the views of our own intelligence agencies, because we have an intimate and sophisticated intelligence sharing arrangement with the Americans and the British, was that there were stockpiles. So I think those things have got to be borne in mind. And in the years that have gone by, there's been this constant claim that we went to war based on a lie. There was no lie. There were errors in intelligence, but there was no lie. And can I also make the observation that the Chilcott report imposes a standard of beyond doubt. Can I offer the view that when you're dealing with intelligence, it's very, very hard to find a situation where advice is beyond doubt. Sometimes if you wait for advice that is beyond doubt, you can end up with very disastrous consequences.
With the benefit of hindsight, do you have any regrets in relation to the conflict?
Look, I regret, clearly, everybody regrets the loss of life in any military conflict. And I've said before, and I repeat it, the hardest decision that I took as Prime Minister, along with my Cabinet colleagues, was commit the men and women of the Australian Defence Force to military conflict. It always bothered me, but I believe that the decision to go into Iraq was justified at the time. And I don't resile from that because I thought it was the right decision.
Do you think the process for going to war needs to be...
I'm sorry?
Sorry. Would you agree, though, that the Middle East has been left in much worse shape post-invasion, that there's a much hardened terrorist threat to Western countries, including our own, and that in hindsight, the world might have been a safer place if
Well, it's Deborah, isn't it? When I my colleagues and I took the decision, we didn't have the hindsight. We took the decision based on the information available. But having said that, I don't share the view that the terrible conflict in the Middle East is the direct consequence of the operation in March of 2003. I don't share that view. I'm sorry?
The rise of ISIS.
Well, ISIS, to a large extent, came out of the confluence of forces coming out of Syria, joining with forces in Iraq. And I might remind you that after the successful surge overseen by General David Petraeus, which the Bush administration undertook, Iraq had entered a period of relative stability, and it also had entered a period where nationwide elections were carried out despite the intimidatory threats of many. And there is a view which I think has a lot of merit, that if the process or the aftermath of the surge had been reinforced by a greater continuing Western, particularly American presence, the situation would have been a lot more stable.
What do you say to calls that the decision-making process...
I'm sorry?
What do you say to calls that the decision-making process on whether Australia goes to war should be removed from the government executive and given to the Parliament for national debate before a decision is made?
Well, we have had debates both in relation to Iraq and also in relation to Afghanistan, and also in relation to the first Gulf War, which was undertaken by the Hawke government. I am personally not in favour of altering the current situation. I mean, the idea that you take out of the hands of the executive a decision of that kind, I'm not sure that I embrace it. I mean, it's part of the responsibility of the executive. And can I remind you that we had a very rigorous decision-making process. I think, in fact, our decision-making process in relation to this operated better than the decision-making process in some other countries. We had a National Security Committee which was attended on a very regular basis, not only by senior ministers, but also by the Chief of the Defence Force, the head of ONA, the head of Foreign Affairs, the head of the Department of Defence, when appropriate, the Australian Federal Police Commissioner. You had all of the relevant people in the room so that there was a proper exchange of views. I mean, I'm happy to see a debate in the community about the process, but anyway, that is a matter for the current government. I'm not Prime Minister anymore. I'm here today because I was the Prime Minister when these events occurred, and I'm very happy to be accountable for them.
But on that point, Mr. Howard, you did it with monetary policy, something very sensitive. Why not consider doing it? Wouldn't there be merit in doing it? Monetary policy. You handed monetary policy over to the independent central bank to make those decisions. So
yes, but what the central bank does is to set interest rates.
Yeah,
It's entire. I don't. With great respect, Paul, I don't liken whether or not to go to war as the same as whether there be a rise of 25 basis points in an interest rate.
That's my point.
I beg your pardon?
Perhaps there's even more of an imperative.
Well, you want to hand everything over to unelected bodies? That's why the British voted to leave the European Union.
Sending men in the housewife.
Back to public opinion. Do you think public opinion of the war would have been different if the Security Council authorisation had been secured, if you'd pushed harder?
Well, can I say there was no hope of getting the French or the Russians to agree. In fact, if you want my view as somebody who was there at the time, was seeing all of the intelligence and making my own assessment, the idea that is implicit in what Chilcott said, if you just kept going, eventually the French and the Russians would agree. They weren't going to agree. And I mean, that is why at the time I said the Labor Party had decided to outsource our foreign policy to the French and the Russians. I mean, they were just never going to agree. That was my judgment. Now, you can say I was wrong. Anybody can say I'm wrong, but that was the basis on which I reached that decision.
And Chilcott found that in 2002.
I'm sorry.
Chilcott found in his report that in 2002.
Oh yes, I'm sorry.
Tony Blair wrote a memo to George Bush saying, "I will be with you, whatever." That's in 2002. Did you give similar assurances to George?
No. I didn't write any memos that I remember to George W. Bush. I mean, I didn't write any such memos. But to be fair to Tony Blair, he contextualised that in what he said last night. I'm not going to pass judgment. Look, I made it very clear to the Bush administration all along that a final decision as to whether our forces would be committed would not be made until the diplomatic process had been exhausted. And that's what we followed. When I vividly remember George Bush ringing me in September of 2002. I was in Queensland at the Liberal Party convention, and he said, I'm thinking of going back to the Security Council for another resolution. Do you think that is a good idea? And I said, yes, it is a good idea. I said, I'm not very hopeful that you will get it, given the attitude that's been taken by the French and the Germans and the Russians to date. But I think it's a very good idea. And he said, Tony Blair wants me to do it because it will strengthen his own position within the British Parliamentary Labor Party. I mean, Blair fought a very courageous fight, in my view, against a lot of hostile opinion within his own party. It was very difficult for him in domestic political terms. And I admired the courage that he displayed on the issue. But that was the reason that Bush gave me for going back. He was not persuaded that it was going to be very productive. He shared the view that I held about the attitude of the French and the Russians and also the Germans, although the Germans, although being influential, were not on the Security Council.
But do you share the view that Tony Blair had already made the decision to go to war in 2002?
Look, I don't know. I can't put myself in Tony Blair's mind. I have no reason to disbelieve what he'd said. I always found him a thoroughly honourable and honest person to deal with. He genuinely held the views that he expressed as far as I could see, and I have no reason to disbelieve him.
Is it time to apologise, particularly to the families of Australians killed in the conflict?
Well, as I understand it, there were no battle deaths in Iraq, but obviously I am sorry for anybody, for the wounds or injuries that anybody suffered. That applies no matter whether a military conflict is a matter of controversy or not. But if you're saying to me, do I apologise for the decision that I took, the core decision, well, I defend that decision. Of course I defend it. I don't retreat from it. I don't believe, based on the information available to me, that it was the wrong decision. I really don't.
You say there have been 2 inquiries in Australia that gel in the flood reports, and therefore there's no need for another one. Isn't it the case that the terms of reference for those inquiries were considerably narrower than the Chilcott Inquiry? And why should there not be a broad range?
Well, I thought they were more than adequate. And the recommendations of the flood inquiry about our intelligence, so I recollect, I think all of those recommendations were implemented by my government or by a subsequent government.
Have you been in touch with Mr. Blair recently? And can you give us an insight into those?
Yes, I saw Mr. Blair in Beijing 2 or 3 weeks ago at a meeting. And we did talk briefly about the Chilcott Inquiry. I think we talked a lot more about whether or not Britain should leave the European Union. It was on that subject he and I had different positions.
What were the nature of the conversations on the Chilcott Inquiry?
Well, he just said that he expected it to come out early in July and that he would be giving a very vigorous response. It's the sort of comment that I expected from him. I think the vitriol that's been directed towards him has been very intense, but that happens when you take difficult decisions, and it was for him domestically a very difficult political decision.
A domestic question, Mr. Howard?
You're not serious, are you?
Is that possible?
You wouldn't want me to feel neglected.
Well, election outcome, have you got any advice from Mr Turnbull on how he can maintain the momentum of fiscal reform, tax reform that were the hallmarks of your government?
Paul, I think if one gets into the detail of that, any advice that I give to Mr Turnbull, to make it effective, I'd like to keep it between Mr Turnbull and me. Look, it is obvious that Australia faces a challenge to get her budget back under control, and it is no secret to anybody in this room, anybody watching these comments, to hear from me that I think we have to return to the reform last. And that means returning to taxation reform, it means returning to industrial relations reform, and it also means returning to fiscal repair. Now, how one does that, and when one does that, is obviously the responsibility of the government of the day, and I don't want to make what is a challenging task for the Prime Minister and the Treasurer even more challenging by saying, well, you've got to do this by such and such. That would be outrageously impertinent of me.
Does the current situation worry you at all, though, that we're in this?
Well, I think we are facing a very difficult challenge, but it ought to worry the people who've been prospectively elected to both houses of Parliament. They ought to worry them more than anybody else. It's their responsibility. I mean, my responsibility is to offer, I hope, constructive comments, loyalty to my party, encouragement to those who've lost their seats, and I feel very much for them, and also another reminder to those who are talking about the philosophical direction of the Liberal Party. If you're a bit worried about the party, stay in and fight. Don't start talking about separate movements. Stay in and fight and argue your case, because the Liberal Party is, as I've always said, a combination of small L Liberals and Conservatives. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm a combination of small L liberalism and conservatism. I think you'd all know from the stances I took on various issues. I had a very liberal economic approach, but I had a conservative approach and retain a conservative approach on social issues and foreign affairs, and I don't apologise for that, I never will. And I just say to people who feel that this or that kidney of the party is being ignored, you stay in and fight. You don't start wandering off the reservation.
Mr Howard, do you agree with Mr Turnbull that Pauline Hanson is not a welcome presence in the Parliament? And what's your response to the fact that she looks like she's going to have an equal block of Senate to Nick Xenophon?
Well, my view is that anybody who is elected by the Australian people should be respected for that fact. I think in relation to Pauline Hanson, the government should do what I did, and that is you deal with her issue by issue. There were some things she said way back when I was Prime Minister that I didn't agree with, and I said that. And, I mean, I don't agree with some of her views on foreign investment. I didn't agree with her when she said we were being flooded by Asians, because we weren't. And I didn't agree with her when she said that Aboriginal people weren't amongst the most disadvantaged in our community, because those things were manifestly wrong. But I did understand that she was articulating the concerns of people who felt left out. And I was very critical of people who branded everybody who supported her as a racist, because that is nonsense. We are not a racist country. And I wish people would stop reaching for that adjective whenever they want to isolate somebody who they don't agree with. We'll get nowhere doing that. Absolutely nowhere.
What about her views on Islam? She wants a royal commission into Islam.
Well, I don't believe in a royal commission into Islam. And can I say, in relation to mosques, if you believe in freedom of religion, you must support the right of people of a particular religion to erect a place of worship, be it a church, a synagogue, a mosque, a temple, whatever it is. I mean, I believe in freedom of religion, and providing the buildings comply with the parking and building ordinance requirements, then it doesn't matter. I mean, you're entitled. I mean, let's just sort of have some basic principles here. Let's not resort to all of these isolating remarks. That gets nowhere. But that includes, may I say it, Pauline Hanson is entitled to the same respect. People have voted for her, and there's no good saying, oh, you know, she's a particularly scorned species. That doesn't achieve anything. You have to recognise that people voted for her. And
Is she whipping up divisive feelings when she rails against Islamic?
look, I've known a lot of people who've sort of railed against this, that or the other, and I think we're tolerant enough and we're sophisticated enough as a society to handle all of that.
But have you got any advice to her about perhaps how she should tend?
No, I'm not going to advise. I'm not her political advisor. I mean, her One Nation vote took a number of seats from my side of politics back in 1998. But I'm not going to give her any advice. She's obviously won a Senate seat, perhaps more in Queensland and perhaps elsewhere. But you just have to, everybody's got to accept that. And to sort of put her in a special corner is stupid. And all it does is enhance her position. I mean, I watched this debate back in 1998 and 1999, and the more she was attacked, the more popular she became, because those attacks enhanced her Australian battler image. And she plays off that. I think you all know that, and you should understand that when, if I may say so with great respect, when you write about her.
Economically, politically and socially, Mr Howard, are you worried about Australia right now?
No, I'm never worried long term about Australia. I'm an optimist about Australia. And some of the flows and eddies of politics at the moment are the same as are occurring in other parts of the world. There is a fragmentation of support for the major political forces, and that is a challenge to the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party has to reach out to people, and that's one of the reasons why I think we should have more democracy in the choice of our candidates in New South Wales. You know, if ever there was a warning to the Liberal Party about the dangers of shrinking factionalism, it's the challenge we now face. We have to reach out to people. Political parties in Australia are no longer mass movements. When I joined the Liberal Party a long time ago, it was far more of a mass movement than it is now, and the same applies with the Labor Party. And if we are to deal more effectively with bodies like Get Up and so forth, which are spruiking the left-wing agenda, there's no argument about that. I think we've got to find a greater capacity to reach out and have a party organisation that is more representative of the people who support us or who want to support us in the community. And I think that's one of the really big challenges that the Liberal Party has, not only here in Sydney but around Australia. One more and then I better go.
Andrew Wilkie said this morning that George Bush, Tony Blair and yourself should face war crimes investigation. What's your response to that? Do you think it's a remote possibility?
Well, I think it's an absurd proposition. I also noted that Andrew Wilkie said this morning that as I read the transcript, and there may be an error in the transcript, I'll enter that caveat, Andrew Wilkie said that the Iraq invasion was responsible for the Bali attack of 2005. What about the Bali attack of 2002? Infinitely greater. I mean, what's the man? And he blamed it on the linked cafe siege. I mean, this is irrational. Thank you.